Welcome to Geared for Growth. This week we're chatting with Daniel Walsh, who's a buyer's agent and founder of Your Property, Your Wealth. Now, Daniel started investing at the age of 19 and at 27 had a property portfolio with 19 properties valued at over $4 million. We have a chat to Daniel about his mindset as a youngster and how he got bitten by the property bug. We also do a deep dive into the types of properties that he's chasing and how he does his due diligence, the areas he selects, and how he selects properties based on the needs of the portfolio. Daniel's very generous with his information, and it's a great interview, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. Here's Daniel. Daniel Walsh, thank you for joining me on Geared for Growth.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Been looking forward to catching up with you, Daniel. I've been following your stuff on social for a while, but for people that haven't heard of you, can you tell us who you are and what you specialise in?
Yeah, so my name's Daniel Walsh and I'm a property investment buyer's agent. So we just specialise in buying investment properties all over Australia in growth areas. So we do a lot of research. A lot of our research comes from in-house, so we don't use anyone else. We actually do our own research to find and uncover growth locations throughout Australia.
And give us some dirt on young Daniel. What posters were on the bedroom wall?
For me, I was back then. I was into surfing and motocross, so it was all about motorbikes and surfing. I'm still into surfing, not so much motorbikes now. I've hurt myself a few times, so more so into the surfing and the posters and that on the wall.
That happens. It's a dangerous occupation with the bikes. How did you get started in property, and what was your first investment, Daniel?
Yeah, so I got started quite young. So I was 16 years old when I actually started looking at property investing. So I knew I wanted to be a property investor by the age of 16 years old. It probably came about with my mum and dad used to flip properties as I was a kid. So I used to do a lot of renovations with my parents. You know, from the age of about 5 years old, I was running around and my parents were flipping properties and renovating. And I remember, my dad told me that he'd made more money from the flipping of properties and buying properties and selling properties than he did in his business. So for me, it was about once I started my job at the age of 16, so I left school at the age of 16 years old, and I realized at that time that a job would not allow me to become financially free and then I needed to do it a different way. And because my parents had done it by property, it was sort of natural for me to go into property myself. I studied from the age of 16 years old up to around the age of 19 years old, and I was saving in that period, so I wasn't earning very much money. I was an apprentice auto electrician at the time, and as you know, any apprentice, they don't earn very much money. And yeah, it was one of those, things that I knew that I had to sacrifice early to be able to do this because I wasn't on a higher wage. And I guess in the back of my head, I was a little bit fearful that I never went to uni or anything like that. So thinking, will I ever get a high paying job? And so for me, it was like, let's just do the hard yards early. I've got a head start on everyone else that was still at school at that time. So I was working for 4 years, saved my first deposit, which was $34,000. And I put my deposit down and actually built a house out near Picton where I lived at the time. It was just a subdivided block, so it wasn't a greenfield area. It was actually subdivided off another house. And we got that for cost price at the time. And I ended up building that whole house, land and house included, for $324,000. And rented it out for $450 a week at the time. So I had a positive cash flow property straight away. It actually was, with the depreciation and everything in there, it was giving me a couple of $100 a week. And at the time, I was only earning probably about $500 or $600 a week at that time. So I realized that quite quickly, if I could repeat this a few times, I'd replace my income quite quickly.
You've given us a whirlwind tour into how you sort of started, but I'm interested to go back a step. At 16, of course, you were following your parents, you were bashing around on the hammer doing the renos, and your old man's giving you that good sort of property education of this is where the money's potentially to be made, son. But what sort of 16-year-old is talking about becoming financially free? You've got to be a little bit unusual in that respect, right?
Oh, definitely. My parents even used to think I was unusual for thinking at that.
With all due respect, Daniel.
Yeah, they were even saying to me. I remember I do a lot of stuff in terms of he's doing this quite young, But I guess my mum and dad instilled into me when I was very young that you needed to get ahead, you needed to start early, and that property was the right way. So for me, it was just all about, I guess, and I just knew straight away. I was working for my dad as an auto electrician, and to be honest, I hated it. It was good working with my dad, but I just knew that for me, I did not want to be working for 40 years. There had to be a better way. And, I see a lot of people, they get into a job and they work, and then next minute they have commitments that come up. They've got kids and they've got, families and all of that. So they get overcommitted that they can never do what they really want to do in life. And I never wanted that. So for me, it was like, before I have these commitments, I'm going to set myself up so I have options for when I have a family and I can do what I want at that time. So I was very fortunate, I guess, to have that mindset very early on. And I had a couple of mentors in my life that were really early. I mean, my parents were one. I had my mortgage broker that, he had 21 properties himself. So I guess I was very lucky in that respect to have older people around me that were, I guess, influencing me on my direction.
Yeah, still an interesting character as a 16-year-old. I had older people around me sort of trying to influence me and, flipping the middle finger. So congrats on you for being weird and breaking the mold there. Talk us through that period from 16 to 19, though. You're working as an apprentice auto electrician. You just mentioned, $500 or $600 a week when you first bought the property, but I'm guessing that took you a couple of years to build up to that. How did you maintain the patience for those sort of 3 years to build up your 34K to get the first property going?
Yeah, I mean, it was tough. When I started, my very first year's wage was $254 per week. I used to work Monday to Friday, and then I would work a Saturday, and my dad would give me $20 cash for the whole day. So, to put that into perspective, I guess today most people wouldn't work for $20 a day. But I guess back then every dollar counted for me. So I knew that back then that I wanted a property, right or wrong, and I wanted to get it as soon as I possibly could. So it was just about saving money. So I did little things like when I was going to TAFE and that, I would car ride with another mate. So we would take it in turn. So I didn't have to spend as much on fuel. I worked with my dad, so I used to make him drive to work every day with me. So I didn't have to spend money on fuel. Everything, phone bills, I didn't have the latest phone. I had an old phone always, and it was just a prepaid, and I took my own lunch every single day. And it was just being about very frugal with your money and making sure, I guess, looking back as well, I guess that taught me some really good money habits because I didn't have much money to play with. So, out of $250 a week, I was saving at least half of that, if not more. And, I was 16 years old, so I'm still living at home, but my parents were still charging me board at that time. And they were doing that to really help me in the long run to say, you have to pay bills and this is what commitments are when you start working. And it really just taught me life lessons very early.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty solid financial apprenticeship that you had there. Talk us through that first property. So you saved up the deposit. What made you buy a block of land and build a house? Was there a deal that fell in front of you, or did you have sort of a sophisticated view on what you wanted to do? Was it an accident that it was cash flow positive? What was your thinking process there, Daniel?
Yeah, so I mean, this was in 2011. So this is after the GFC in Sydney. No one was buying at that time, and I had people even telling me when I was buying a property, "Oh, you're going to go broke. You're too young to be buying property. What are you doing? You're overcommitted." All that type of stuff. So for me, I really fell into that property itself. So it was subdivided land. The land was extremely cheap. So compared to anything else around, there wasn't that much land that was getting released at the time. And I thought to myself, well, I did all the numbers and went, okay, I can build this for $320,000. Why not build it? And then I went and got a rental appraisal, and I thought I'm going to get $450,000. So I did all my numbers before I actually jumped into the property, but I worked out that it was going to give me roughly a couple of $100 a week because of the cash flow scenario. So it wasn't that it was, I wanted it to be new or secondhand or anything like that. It was just I did the numbers on the deal at that time, and it was probably one of the best deals that I'd seen. I'm not for house and land packages and all of that, and that's why I guess I did it on my own. I built the house on my own. I did the land, everything, the landscaping myself, all for cost price. So it was about, I guess, back then being frugal with my money again and making sure that I get the right property for me first time round. I knew that the first property, if I could get that to grow in value and get the right property, then that would supercharge me into buying more property, which it did quite quickly.
And let's talk about your second investment property. I'm interested in the learning that you took away from that when you used the same bank. But can you talk us through what that property was, and then talk about those financing issues against?
Yeah. So the property that I bought second, it was actually only a street over from my first one, but it was a mortgagee sale. So the guy actually in 2008 paid $310,000 for the property. In 2012, I bought that property off him for $303,000. So I actually bought it cheaper than what he did. And only about 5 years later, we doubled our money on it. So he would have been kicking himself for that. But what I guess back then, I still didn't have much money. So I actually had to use my first property as security as my second property. Now, when I bought my first property, I bought that with a 5% deposit. So I'm pretty highly leveraged at this time, but I knew that I was young and that I wanted to, I guess, do well in property, and I was willing to take that risk at that time. And I had already done the calculations on the cash flow. So I put 5% deposit down on the first property. I then, that went up in value a bit. I then used it as security for my second property. The second property, I wanted to then buy a third one because they started going up. And what I'd realized at that time, I was with one bank, that bank would no longer let me buy any more property. They said I had serviceability issues. So I wanted to move banks at that time. And back then I first was just going to the banker. You know, you go into the bank, you get the loan, you come back out. And I went in there and he said, you can't borrow. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to move to a different bank. He said, you can't do that either because we're holding your house as security. So that means that I was stuck. And it actually took me 2 years. I had to wait for the property prices to grow until I could actually get enough equity to release the securitization and be able to move banks. At that time, I realized that I needed to have a good broker on my side, which I've now still got him today. And we've been working together for, quite a few years now. And he had 21 houses at the time. So I knew that if somebody had 21 houses, they could definitely help me out. And, he's been obviously my mentor as well for now. And, we're able to get into the next property after that, my third and fourth property, quite quickly. So I guess it was just that little bit of a road bump at the start. And that really comes down to the importance of having a really good team behind you. And I realized that after I made that mistake.
With trying to move banks, was the issue that the bank that you were trying to move to wouldn't let you sort of have as high an LVR? What was the main reason why you couldn't move over for those 2 years?
Yeah, so it's because I hadn't gone up enough in value at that time. So I was still, roughly 95% LVR on that. And I couldn't move banks because it hadn't gone up enough in value at that time. But CBA as well, I had some cash money on hand, but it wasn't enough money. But I was with Commonwealth Bank, but the serviceability at Commonwealth Bank at the time was a lot harder than some other second-tier lenders. So I wanted to go to a second-tier lender with one of my loans and release some equity, but they wouldn't let me do that. And I wanted to release the first property, but I couldn't get that because the second property was securitization. So they wouldn't let me release that property. So for me, it was, I guess, a sit back and wait for the property prices to rise, which did significantly over the 2 year period, which allowed me to get out of that situation quite quickly. I guess I was very fortunate that I was able to, right that wrong very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's a fair amount of luck in that market accelerating as quickly as it did. I'm guessing that was a pretty tiresome 2 years waiting, because after that happened, your portfolio then expanded pretty rapidly. Can you talk us through how you were able to do that? I'm assuming that you're still on the modest income, and what sort of properties were you chasing?
Yeah, so at that time, still on a modest income, I couldn't afford Sydney anymore. That was sort of out the window for me. It was just too highly priced. Couldn't service. So for me, I had to expand my horizons and start looking into states. So I went into places like Brisbane, where I could buy a house back in around that $250,000 mark. And I ended up buying 3 properties in Brisbane at that time. So it was, I guess, looking outside of my own backyard at that time and being able to really get involved into other states. And that's when it started to really expand my horizon on that I needed to diversify my portfolio anyway. And that's what I continued doing after that.
Now, I want to have a good balance here, because we've talked about earning $250 odd bucks a week. We've talked about you expanding your portfolio to 3 houses in Brisbane straight away. I want to keep the balance. We don't want to go too glamorous too early, Daniel. I want to talk about the pain. As a young fella, you've smashed through this idea that millennials can't delay gratification. They've got to have the newest iPhone and the best car and that sort of stuff. But you had some hurt. I want to know about the hurt. I want to talk about the baked beans, the bomb car. I know you're very big on the mindset side of things, but can you talk us through your sort of life in the trenches, as it were, as you were sort of kicking things off?
Yeah, I mean, as strong as my mindset was as a young guy, it was quite challenging. You see your friends out there in brand new cars, and they were leveraged up, getting loans and buying brand new XR6 turbos, and you wished you could have one. We'd all go out driving on a weekend, and I'm driving a $1,500 car at that time. So it was quite challenging back then. I think more so from my peers, being that they were out there earning good money. Some of them were laborers, so they were earning good money, and I'm an apprentice, and they were, in brand new cars, and I guess seemed to be doing a lot better than I was. And I kept coming back to the mindset always of, it doesn't matter in 10 years' time, you're going to be better off by doing this. You need to continue the path. And I was very strict on what I wanted to do. And for me, I already knew my end goal before I even started. So I already had a plan of action that I wanted to achieve and be able to get those properties under my belt. So I always just thought to myself at the start, if I had a property for 300 grand, it goes to 600 grand, I've made myself $300,000. And I could do that in a 10-year period. Now, I couldn't save that kind of money. So I'm like, why not? I need to do this, Whereas if I bought a car that for $40,000 in 5 to 10 years' time, it's worth nothing. And I knew that. So it was all about having assets that would appreciate over time rather than, liabilities that are going to depreciate over time. So I didn't want to waste my money. And for me, I wanted to get to the age of, say, 30 years old and wanted to go on the holidays, and I wanted to live the lifestyle that I always aspired to. But I knew that I had to put roughly 10 to 15 years in place of sacrificing that time. And for me, I guess I just stuck with it. I knew the end goal. And I think that's the most important thing is, if you want to achieve something, you've got to know your end goal. And if you know your end goal and the why is strong enough, you'll continue through that path regardless of how tough it becomes.
I think that's some pretty strong advice. And I'm repeatedly getting some questions from younger listeners, and I'm interested if there are any resources you can point them to, or advice for people that maybe are picking up what you're putting down but just unsure how to take the next step.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like financial advice, or in terms of what to look for? Or
yeah, look, I think there are a lot of people that are listening that are aspiring investors, and that they do sort of understand the need to delay the gratification. You've shared some videos talking about savings, which I definitely wanted to ask you about, because I mean there's a podcast title that's going to get some clicks. Why savers are losers. But yeah, look. Talk to us about the sort of financial advice in setting a savings plan, and then once you sort of get that nest egg and you've got that discipline, how do you take the next step? I mean, how do we get to that point where we are enjoying some of the fruits of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be look at the long term. So for me, I guess you've got to look at the next 10 to 15 years, and you've got to do it over the long term. A lot of people try to get rich, and young kids, I guess, they're coming out of school and then they're starting their careers, and they're looking for the next get rich quick, crypto and all this stuff that came out, and they're all thinking they're going to be millionaires. And what I, say to someone is, the person that tries to get rich quick ends up going broke even quicker. So you've got to be very careful of what you're doing. Be methodical in what you want to do, and look at the long term, because no one gets rich quick. You've got to do it over the long term. In terms of, say, like financial sort of thing, financial management, I guess at a young age, what I did was I had 2 bank accounts. So I had a bank account that was for me, and that was my spendings each week, and I would allow myself to have so much in my spendings. But then I would have another bank account, and it was with a totally different bank, and that was my savings, and it would automatically debit into there. So I'd automatically have money go into there for my savings. And why I did that was because any young person, they want to go out and party, and it's very easy to blow all their money and wake up the next day and say, where did it go? Whereas if I didn't have a card to that or access to it, and because it was in a different bank, it would actually take me a day to transfer it over. Gives you a lot of time to start thinking about if it's the right choice, whether you want to spend the money or not. So I did that from a very young age. I used to just transfer all my savings. So I almost basically paid myself first. I paid into my savings first, which was my goal of obviously buying properties. And then I used whatever was left to go out there and live life at that time, I guess. And I guess when you do it that way, you don't feel guilty about spending that money because you've saved first before you've actually spent, and you know exactly what your money management is. So I think just keeping your money management under wraps very early and getting really strict with your budget is something that you need to do. And that way you can actually forecast how long it's going to take you to save a deposit, because you're saving very diligently and you're saving each week the same amount. So you can then look forward once it becomes obviously to that stage where you want to buy. The best thing I think these days is we've got buyers agents around, and we've got like people like me that now helping other people. And, you don't have to go through the 10 years of making mistakes now. You can actually leverage someone else's knowledge quite quickly. And a lot of these people, even like myself, I give a lot of free advice out there. I've got ebooks out there. I've got videos out there. I do videos daily. And so you can be well informed as a property investor these days a lot easier than it was, say, 10 years ago.
That's some fantastic advice. I really like those saving tips and the separate bank account and the idea that what's left you actually can still blow and have fun. I think that's I think that's pointing people definitely in the right direction. If we can sort of change, demographics to the people that maybe have a couple of properties in the portfolio. I've read a couple of things where you make your sort of property acquisition purchase based around the current capabilities of the portfolio and what it might need or what it might be able to sustain. Can you explain how you sort of select a property based on how it fits within the pool of properties?
Yeah, so I guess when I look at someone's situation, if it's myself or my clients, what I normally do is I sit down and first look at their cash flows and see where their cash flows are. Whether they've got high-paying jobs, low-paying jobs, whether their lifestyle is quite high or quite low. And that way we can then determine really what sort of property and yield we need for one. If you don't have much cash flow each week, well, it's going to make more sense to buy something with higher cash flow so that it doesn't drain your lifestyle. Because if you sell out early, well, obviously that's not going to be real good in terms of being able to achieve your goals. So I always look at the client as a whole. And say, what do they need in their portfolio? If they've already got 3 or 4 properties, I would look at the 3 or 4 properties, look at which state they're in, look at what type of dwelling they have, and then see what they don't have in their portfolio. So let's say they bought everything in Brisbane right now, and they had 3 or 4 properties with really high cash flow, and they earned pretty good money, and things were steadily going up for them. I would look at maybe something that's going to be higher capital growth and maybe a little bit lower cash flow because their portfolio could sustain that. So it's all about putting into the portfolio what it doesn't already have. So if you've got really negatively geared properties, well, it doesn't make sense to keep going that way. You want to balance that out with some high cash flow properties. And I guess on the reverse side of that, if you have really high cash flow properties, you don't want to keep going that way either, because you can actually subdue your overall capital growth over the long term. And it's not saying that they're not going to grow, because I've had my cash flow properties double in 6-7 years. But it's about making sure you diversify your portfolio. So if they're in Brisbane, maybe put some in Victoria, or maybe in South Australia or New South Wales, or wherever you think at that time that the market's growing. So that comes down to obviously research, but it's really about balancing that portfolio overall. I think not too many property investors balance their portfolio. They keep going in one direction, and if that direction doesn't work out, well, then their whole portfolio doesn't work out.
That's a really interesting point, because I was going to ask you, is it by necessity that high cash flow properties can't grow, or that growth properties have a low cash flow? But you've sort of you've tweaked that a little bit to sort of say, well, okay, well maybe you've got high cash flow in southeast Queensland or Brisbane, and it's doing well in a growth point of view, but you're missing out on that diversification. And if you went to Melbourne, the yields just aren't necessarily there, but the growth is. Am I putting the right words in your mouth there, Daniel?
I mean, to put it in an example, we had a client that had 3 properties in Brisbane themselves. They earned very good money together. They had high cash flow properties, and as you would know, Brisbane's steadily gone up, but it hasn't broken any records. We had some areas in Victoria at the time that I was doing a lot of research on, and I said to them, now you've already got the cash flow, you've already got the properties in Queensland. They wanted to go back to Queensland. They think this is the market to be in. This is a few years, 3 years ago. And I'm saying to them, that's great, but what happens if Brisbane doesn't grow, which as we know now, it hasn't taken off. It's done all right, but it hasn't taken off. If they had to put more properties there, their portfolio would be lagging a little bit. So what we did at that time was I said, you've got nothing in Victoria, so let's diversify it. Remember, the end goal, we're looking at 15 years. You're doing this for the long term. You want to be putting properties in different markets because different markets grow at different times. So we put them in Victoria at that time. It took us 2 years to make 65% growth in that market. So to put that into perspective, I guess you made 65% growth, and in Brisbane over that same period, you probably made about 15.
That's very different metrics depending on the price of entry, I guess. I'm interested in. We're going to have to trot out another cliche. We've done the growth versus cash flow. I'm going to have to do the houses versus units, but I'm blaming it on you, Daniel, because you actually have said that you're buying houses more than units. Can you run us through the rationale and the reasoning for that?
Yeah, so it's not that I would never buy a unit or a townhouse or anything like that. What I see is in the current market is we're seeing oversupply in units. We're seeing in most markets, and we're seeing the same with townhouses. So for me, I would rather buy land because I do know that over the next 10 to 15 years, land is going to become more scarce, right? And they're changing zoning. So as soon as something becomes populated, they change the zoning, they change the height restrictions, and next minute they're whacking up massive towers, and there's no end to that. And once they do that, you're going to be in a 60 to 80 square meter box, and it looks the same as the 50 others that have just been put up. And then it's very hard to rent your property out. And we've seen that happen obviously in Sydney and in your Parramatta's and that way you're seeing oversupply. Now, it does come down to where you select the property though. So, I mean, there's no use going into Coogee and going, I want a house in Coogee because it's probably not affordable to you. And people are likely to want to live in a unit. So you really go for what's in demand, not only for resale, but what's in demand for that market for rent. So where I typically buy at the moment is affordable properties, anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 roughly. And we're picking anywhere from sort of your 15 minutes out of the CBD to an hour out of the CBD roughly at the moment, because we're seeing significant growth. And I've actually got examples of where it's beaten blue chip tenfold over the last 20 years. And and we always stick to the houses because as population grows, it grows out. And as the population grows out, the land becomes scarce. If you buy 20 minutes out, 30 minutes out, that land is becoming more scarce as people are moving out. And as we know, regardless of what people say, people want a backyard if they can have it. It's just that they can't have the backyard in Coogee. If they could, they would. So we know that that's going to be in more demand over the next 15 years rather than a townhouse or unit, especially if you're 15, 20 minutes out of a CBD in like Brisbane or something like that.
I think that's an interesting insight that you're selecting the property type based on what's actually in demand in the area rather than just going houses or units because of the fundamentals of them as a type of stock. That's an interesting one. I want to ask you some other things that I've noticed, like with the properties that you're purchasing or you're showing that you've purchased on your website. They've got a few things in common. Houses we've talked about. They're all relatively new from what I can see. None of them seem to have terrible yields. I'd say they're probably higher than average across the country. Can you give us an idea about how your sort of due diligence works? Why you think these properties are sort of looking fairly similar from an aesthetic and a fundamental point of view, or am I just not digging deep enough?
I mean, it's just probably the sum that are on the website, that we've got plenty of old properties and big blocks and different things. But typically what we're looking for is obviously your houses. If you buy, it depends on really the client as well and what they're wanting to do with, renovations. And if they don't want renovations, do they want low maintenance? So that comes down to it. With the yield as well, it really, your Victoria yields at the moment, we're only getting roughly 4.5% in Victoria. But we're doing different things with that. So we've got a property that we just put under contract, and it's an old 40-year-old home. We're going to retain the front house. We're going to renovate it, and then we're putting a house. So we're going to build a house down the back of the block. So that's for a different client. The total cost of that will be roughly $1 million. And we're going to receive high capital growth over the next 15 years for that. In terms of, I guess, what we do purchase, it comes down to really the client and what they need in their portfolio. Like I said, higher cash flow or lower. We always look for buying under market value, which is why we don't typically buy a lot of property because we can't find that many properties throughout the year. So I stick to working with 6 clients per month. We're very strict on our 6 client policy. So if we have more than 6, you've got to fall into another month. Reason being is we're trying to find the best property every month for you. And, they don't come up every single day. So we've got one that's a deceased estate and we're about to put an offer on it today, and we'll get that roughly $30,000 under market value. So that'll give them an instant equity, but it's also a property that's near water. So we know that the land's going to be scarce there. It's a 2003 build, so we know it's not too much maintenance. It's just your typical paint and carpet. So I guess what you've got to look at as well, people, especially in Queensland, they go for these, old high-set Queenslanders, but the maintenance side of things is really high on them. And if you don't do the maintenance, you're going to have a property that's going to deteriorate very quickly. So for me, I like to stick to brick homes, unless I'm going to knock it down. So it's always about what's the intent of that property. But if I'm not going to knock it down and I want to hold this for the next 15 years, then I want to buy something that's a brick home and a really good solid land content and something that's going to be in demand for rent. So these brick houses, you might buy a 4 2 and 2 or something like that. It's going to be appealing for the families that are living in those types of areas. And that way we're going to receive high demand in rent. And that's why we get high yields, often between sort of 5 and 6 and sometimes, up to 6.5% yields in these types of properties. So yeah, that's sort of what we do in terms of looking for properties. But it comes down to anything, what do you want to do with that property is really the goal before you even buy that property.
I want to dive in a little bit more on the examples that you've sort of shared. You're normally buying around the 300 to 500K mark, but you sort of shared that case study of someone who's got the house that they're going to sort of subdivide and build on the back, and that's maybe a $1 million play. Is it the case that there's more money to be made at the higher end of the spectrum? I'm guessing that there's less competition when we're talking about some of these more expensive deals, and of course once you sort of if you're a property developer, once you get past the sort of the 3 townhouses into the more units, then arguably there are less players and there's more money to be made. Is that a similar thing with property investing, and does that sort of inform the types of deals that you're looking for if the client's capacity?
It really comes down to, I guess, the market in that area. So when we were buying in Victoria, let's say 3 to 4 years ago, I was telling people at that time, and to put that into perspective, I guess, Sydney versus in Melbourne 3 or 4 years ago, I was telling people to stop buying in Sydney 3 or 4 years ago. And that's because they were paying $1 million for a house. So I was looking at that and saying, no, buy affordable. Buy at the moment in Victoria, you can pick up a house for $350,000 with development potential. So we could put the 3 townhouses or 4 townhouses on it. Sometimes we could even retain one of the houses and put a house at the back. But for $350,000, I knew the capacity for that to go for $350 up to $700 was easy in the next 5 to 10 years because people could still afford it. So even if it goes to $700,000, people could still afford it on the incomes in the area, whereas Sydney, they couldn't do that. So it's really about looking at the whole picture and the research, and actually, so you can be, it's going to be $1 million, but this is near water in Victoria. It's really considering, so you can be a house with 650 square meters a block, 6 meter side access for $435,000. It's almost a no-brainer that you're going to make money off that, whether you do the development now or whether you DA it and sell the block off later on. Or even now, there was a lot of different options with that. And even somebody that was wanting something affordable at $435,000, we could have bought that for that client. And if they didn't have the money to do the development, they could have still sat on that property for the next 15 years and done very, very well out of it. So it's all about looking at the potential of the property. But for me, it's also looking about, can we see this property going from where it is today to doubling, and how long will that take? Looking at the incomes in the areas and looking at what's happening in neighbouring suburbs. So Victoria, where we're buying, there was a neighbouring suburb of a $750,000 median house price, and we were buying at $350,000. You could almost see writing on the wall that once the $750,000 becomes unaffordable, it's going to naturally flow onto the suburb with $350,000. And we saw that those houses go from roughly 350 to 550 within a 2-year period. So it was quite quick. I guess that's also another note as well, buying blue chip versus not buying blue chip, I guess, in quotes, where people will think that blue chip will always grow more than something that's not blue chip. I actually debunked that. So I compared it, and I've got a blog that's coming out on it with the exact addresses and everything. And we've got a house in Victoria. We paid $345,000 for it, but in 1998 it was worth $91,000. So it's gone up 6 times. Whereas we did the same analogy with a 2-bedroom red brick unit in Coogee on the water. So it's your blue chip property on the water unit in Coogee, and that had only gone up 3x. So that was $315,000 in 1998. That's what it sold for, and it just recently sold for $825,000, and that was only a couple of months ago. So we 3x'd, well, that property 3x'd, whereas this other property in Victoria, which was 40 minutes out of the CBD, 6x'd at that time.
That's interesting because from the outside it looks like, well, that Coogee one is a good investment. It's pretty successful. But yeah, obviously the numbers are showing that you've beaten that pretty consistently. You raise an interesting point with say incomes versus house prices. It's an interesting study when you do look at the sort of Sydney versus Brisbane metrics. House prices are obviously far cheaper in Brisbane. The house price to income ratios, I mean, Brisbane, there are a lot of professionals working on similar incomes, or maybe they might be slightly less than Sydney, but there's a lot better affordability. Is that part of the reason why you're looking to Brisbane, or is that sort of an Australia-wide thing? You look at the incomes versus the house price, and you just sort of see where is the obvious way to move?
Yeah, I mean, I guess firstly, when we're looking at where we want to purchase, it's going to be state by state first. That will come down to things like what's the wages, what's the economic growth in the area, what's the interstate migration, what's the population growth, what's, you've got to look at all of these, I guess, metrics before you even start looking in an area. You've got to look at the state and how's that state performing. We've noticed that Brisbane is lagging behind, and we've seen that it's been a market where jobs weren't so great over the last 10 years, but we're also seeing now a lot of infrastructure becoming apparent there, and a lot more building, and we're seeing health and education improve over that area. So we're seeing a lot more jobs in that state. So Brisbane itself is getting a lot more high-paying jobs, and people are now able to move, which we saw obviously the net interstate migration, 15,000 were lost in New South Wales last year, and they went to Brisbane or other states, but we would say they've probably gone to Brisbane. We're seeing Brisbane actually overtake Victoria in terms of net interstate migration as well. And why we're seeing that is because it's affordable, and we're seeing a lot of people saying, I don't want to have this $1 million mortgage in Sydney anymore. I can go up and live a easier, better lifestyle on very similar money. It might be a little bit less, but very similar money. And I can do this in Brisbane and knock my mortgage down and have half the mortgage instead of. So that's why we started looking to Brisbane. Then we've got to go into more of a micro, I guess, analogy and look at analysis on what area we're going to buy in and why. That comes down to area research that we do roughly 20 pages on each council, and it comes down to a select criteria that we look at. So we're looking at things like wages. We're looking at supply and demand. So what's happening in the supply, what's happening on the demand side. We're looking at population growth. We're looking at infrastructure, average annual growth rate. Again, average annual growth rate will not tell you what's going to happen in the future, but it's an indication. If it's already grown significantly, why will it stop growing? That's what I asked the question. And if it hasn't grown, why will it start growing? And that's where Brisbane is at the moment. It hasn't grown yet very, very much since 2009. Yet I'm looking for reasons on why it will grow, because it's actually it's behind the 8 ball in terms of performance. And we've got to look at, will that perform now over the next 5 to 10 years? And that comes down to asking these questions. So we look at days on market, how quick are things selling, vendor discounts. We look at vacancy rates, sales volumes. You've got to paint a picture, and you've got to ask these questions. And if you don't know the answers to the questions, you shouldn't be really buying anything, because at the end of the day, if you're not an informed investor, you're a speculator.
Yeah, look, and there are certainly some informed investors that are doing the work very well and doing great due diligence and understand all of the moving parts of the market. But I'd encourage people that don't have that confidence to either do the research or, as a beautiful segue here, this sounds like a sponsored segment, but let me be quick to declare that there are no fiduciary interests in the podcast. But you've started your buyer's agency, Your Property, Your Wealth, and I'm guessing that was sort of, I guess, spurned on by the fact that you've sort of commented in the past you could have 2x'd or 3x'd your results had you had the right team around you from the beginning. Is that a bit of a motivation for starting the agency?
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of things for starting the agency. One was, I guess, one of them was I made a couple of mistakes early on in my investing journey, which actually cost me over $1 million. And I didn't want other people to make that mistake. And that was a lot on the mindset thing. You know, I had two properties in Sydney where one of them I was going to buy and subdivide the back off, and the other one I was going to buy in towards Camden Way, which, as you know, both of those areas had doubled in that period of time, 7 years. I actually had contracts on both of the properties, and I backed out because I wasn't confident at that time. And that was, you know, I was only 21 or 22 at the time when I started doing that. But I backed out of those two deals, which cost me, if I had a subdivider, it would have cost me $1.5 million in terms of equity gain. And I look at that and I think the reason why I didn't go ahead with those is because I didn't have a mentor at that time, a strong enough mentor to keep me on my track and why. And it wasn't that I didn't want to achieve it. It was the fact that I was just a little bit scared. You know, I was at that time the only one that had bought these properties and had leveraged myself up. And I wanted to be, I guess, doing it in a way that was safe. And I was kept sort of coming back. Am I doing this in a safe way? Am I doing it in a safe way? And I guess I talked myself out of it. So I cost myself some money in that respect. But the other thing as well was when I started my buyer's agency, there was so many people out there at the time spruiking property and people getting stung. And, you know, someone was getting a kickback of $30,000 or $40,000 from a developer and all that type of stuff. And I could see it happening even with friends. You know, they're talking to me saying, "Oh, I've got this, you know, nice property here that somebody's, financial advisor or someone's come to me about." And I realized, I'm like, that property's not going to make any money. It's actually you're going to lose. You know, you're paying well over what it's worth. So I realized at that time I sort of had a duty of care to start teaching investors the right way. And that was just the way that I had achieved my success at that time. So I really wanted to give back, and that's why I give a lot of free content out there. I talk to a lot of people on my Instagram. I give a lot of value. I did a 40-minute live last week on just answering questions. And I do that because I know that if I can answer a question and stop somebody going to a property spruiker, well, then I've done my job. So really it was about helping clients be more informed before they make a decision on buying a property.
Love it. And we talked about the pain and some of the success. Where are you in your journey at the moment, Daniel? Are you still at the sort of, you know, keeping frugal and putting the resources into property, or are you enjoying some of the spoils? Where are you on the journey at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the last 2 years, probably not. I've still been buying property. I bought a property last year, but I've got 9 properties at the moment. My position's a little bit different, I guess, these days. I'm not highly leveraged anymore. So I've roughly got $4 million in property with a $2 million equity stake. So I'm only 50% LVR. I've got passive income from those properties that I now pays for the immediate expenses. So it's not a huge amount, but it does pay for all my immediate expenses. So I do get to go on a lot more holidays. You know, I probably spend now roughly 8 weeks a year on holidays. And I guess I've done the hard yards to do that. So, you know, last year I went to the Maldives, and I go to Bali every year. I go camping a lot. I'm going next week or tomorrow, actually. I'm going camping for a week and a half. And I guess it's now about enjoying a little bit, because you need to enjoy your hard work at some point. And it's not that you don't want to keep working hard. It's just that to keep you on the right path, you need to enjoy it at some point. And if you don't do that, then you'll fall off the bandwagon, I guess, and start to derail yourself because you're working just so hard at a plan that you're never going to see the fruits of your labor. So now I'm sort of enjoying it a little bit more. And I guess my portfolio is in a position where I've already built the immediate portfolio. So my accumulation phase has slowed down. And now I'm just doing it safely and just continue to increase my cash flow.
Nice, and that's a pretty handy LVR too. I would have assumed it would be a lot higher, so you're sitting pretty comfy there. The Bali trips, the camping, the Maldives, nice work if you can get it, mate. There'll be a few people listening that'll say, I'll have what he's having. How do they get in touch with you to find out some more info, or to yourself, Daniel?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if they want to send us an email, they can send me a direct email, which is daniel@ypyw.com.au. But also, I guess for people who are listening, if they want to get educated and they want to, listen a bit more about what I do, jump on our Facebook page, Your Property, Your Wealth, or Instagram, Your Property, Your Wealth, and even my personal Instagram, which is Daniel Walsh _YPYW. And I give a lot of information out on all those platforms. So, they can get in touch there. And if they want to download, I've got an ebook out there, which is 0 to 3.5 million in 6 years. I've got that on our website as well. At the top, they can download that, and it's 50 pages worth of content that I've really condensed over the last 10 years of my investing journey. I condensed it down to an ebook into 50 pages so people can have a read of that and I guess see if what I do resonates with them.
Beautiful. Love it, mate. Thank you for sharing that information. And just to sort of to bookend us, if there's one piece of advice that you could impart to property investors, if you had to sort of cut it down to one, what would it be? Investing
is 90% mindset. And if you do not have a strong mindset, you won't become a successful investor. So you have to have the mindset, because everyone can earn, the same amount of wages, but it comes down to the mindset and what you do with it. So having a strong mindset is definitely up there.
Beautiful. I love it. Danny, thank you very much for being so generous with your time and humble with the things that you've got wrong and sharing the success as well. It's been a pleasure.
No worries. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for having me on the show as well. It's been great talking to you.
Awesome. Cheers, mate. Go pack the tent.